Picture the North Sea in the 5th century. Low wooden boats moving across dark water, carrying families away from the coasts of what is now northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. They were heading toward a former Roman province where imperial rule had recently collapsed. This is the image most of us grew up with. Rome left Britain, and 3 peoples arrived to take its place: Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They defeated the native Britons, drove the survivors west, and became the English. For a long time, that was treated as settled history. Ancient DNA has now confirmed part of it. Hundreds of genomes recovered from early medieval English graves show that people really did cross that sea in large numbers. But the same evidence exposes the one detail the old story got wrong. This was never one invasion carried out by one uniform people. It was something slower, messier, and far more human. You can see it in a mixed cemetery near Cambridge. You can see it even more clearly in one family from Kent, whose bones let researchers watch 2 ancestries merge across 3 generations. The traditional account begins around the year 410, when Roman authority in Britain effectively ended. The legions were needed elsewhere, and the province was left to defend itself. Roman-British elites struggled to hold the island together, and groups from across the North Sea began arriving in growing numbers. Our main written source for this period comes from Bede, an English monk writing in the early 8th century. That is roughly 300 years after the events he described. Bede named the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes as the founding peoples of England, each settling a different part of the island. He was a careful historian for his era, but he was not a witness to the 5th century, and he had no scientific evidence at all. His account helped turn older origin traditions into one coherent story of English beginnings. That story endured because it was useful. It gave later generations a clean point of origin, a decisive break from Roman and British Britain, and a fresh start built by continental settlers. The problem is that a compelling origin story and an accurate population history are not the same thing. For centuries, nobody had the tools to tell the difference. By the 20th century, archaeologists had split into 2 camps. One side argued for something close to mass replacement. Large numbers of Anglo-Saxon settlers arrived, and the existing British population was killed, pushed west, or reduced to a lower status. The other side argued for elite dominance instead. A small number of continental warriors took power, and the local population simply adopted their language and customs because that was now the path to status. Both theories rested on the same evidence, which was whatever survived in the ground. Burial customs changed. Continental-style brooches appeared. Place names shifted from British to Old English across large parts of the island. But none of this could tell researchers whose bodies were actually in those graves, or how many people had truly moved. A brooch does not carry ancestry. A sword does not carry a family tree. Objects travel through trade and fashion far more easily than people travel through migration. So a grave full of continental-style goods could mean an immigrant family, or it could mean a local family copying continental style. For decades, that uncertainty kept the debate open. What finally settled it was not a new theory. It was direct evidence taken from the people who lived through the transition themselves. In 2022, a landmark study published in the journal Nature analyzed ancient genomes from 460 individuals across medieval northwestern Europe. 278 of them came from England. It was, at the time, the largest ancient genetic dataset ever assembled for this period. And for the first time, researchers could measure ancestry directly in the bones of people who had actually lived through the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. The findings confirmed that the migration was real and that it was large. Across much of early medieval England, researchers found a clear rise in ancestry closely related to populations living around northern Germany, the northern Netherlands, and Denmark. In some sampled communities in eastern England, that continental ancestry reached as high as roughly 76%. That figure needs an immediate qualification. It describes specific sampled populations in parts of eastern England during this period. It is not a fixed number for every early English person, and it is certainly not a percentage that applies to modern English people, whose ancestry has been reshaped by more than 1,000 additional years of history since these graves were closed. Using one regional early medieval sample as a permanent national average would badly misuse the evidence. What the study did show clearly is that migration on this scale could not have come from a small ruling class alone. The elite dominance model, at least in its strongest form, could not explain a genetic shift this large. The side of the old debate that argued for substantial population movement was closer to what the bones actually show. But as the same study went on to reveal, scale was never the part of the old story that was wrong. Bede's 3 named peoples suggest 3 separate, identifiable populations. Ancient DNA cannot support that level of precision. The continental ancestry found across early medieval England traces back to a broad and overlapping zone along the North Sea coast, and the people living in that zone were never one uniform population to begin with. The genomes recovered from English graves cannot be sorted into clean categories labeled Anglo-Saxon or Jute. Those are historical labels from a written source. Ancestry, in the ground, does not divide itself so neatly. The migration's impact also varied enormously by region. Continental ancestry appeared strongest in central and eastern England, facing the North Sea directly. It measured noticeably lower in the southwest, where the older, local British population remained a much larger share of the community. That alone breaks the schoolbook image of one even wave crossing the whole island at once. The evidence is also consistent with migration, involving both men and women, not simply warriors marrying into a local population. That detail matters. It shifts the picture from a purely military conquest towards something closer to families and communities relocating together alongside whatever conflict did occur. And crucially, grave goods did not track cleanly with ancestry at all. Some people, buried with continental-style weapons, carried little continental ancestry. Some people, with strong local ancestry, were buried in a fully continental style. Objects reflect fashion and status. They are not a substitute for a genome. To see what this actually meant for real communities, researchers turned to a cemetery at Oakington, near Cambridge, alongside related sites at Linton and Hinxton, studied in earlier work published in 2016. At Oakington, scientists sequenced ancient genomes from individuals buried in the same early Anglo-Saxon cemetery, following the same customs, laid out in the same style, with similar grave goods. Genetically, these people were not the same. 2 individuals closely matched the incoming continental population. A third matched the local British-related ancestry that had existed in the region before the migration. A fourth showed a mixture of both, yet all 4 had been buried according to the same emerging tradition, in the same community, and treated as members of the same social world. This is the detail that quietly undoes the old invasion story. If ancestry and cultural identity always move together, a cemetery like Oakington should show a sharp divide. It does not. A person with mostly local ancestry could still be, culturally and socially, an early Anglo-Saxon. Belonging to this new identity was never the same thing as being biologically continental, even in its earliest generations. Oakington is one cemetery, and it cannot speak for the whole of England. But it proves that mixture was not an abstraction. It was how people actually lived beside one another. The clearest evidence for how that mixture actually happened did not come from a percentage or a map, though. It came from one family, buried at Buckland, near Dover, in Kent, where researchers traced ancestry across several linked generations within a single cemetery. The earlier members of this family carried ancestry that was mostly continental, consistent with recent migrant origins. At some point, a woman joined the family whose ancestry connected instead to Western Britain or Ireland, a population quite distinct from the continental settlers. Her children, and their children after them, carried a blend of both lines, ancestry that had arrived from across the North Sea and ancestry rooted in the older populations of the British Isles were now combined in the same descendants, buried in the same family plot, generation after generation. What makes this so striking is what did not change alongside the ancestry. Grave goods appeared on both sides of the family, among individuals with mostly continental ancestry and among their mixed descendants alike. Cultural practice did not retreat as biological mixture increased. This family kept burying its members as participants in one shared tradition, no matter how their ancestry had blended underneath it. This is integration made visible at the smallest possible scale, not a statistic describing thousands of anonymous burials, but one household whose bones let us watch two distinct populations become one family within a few generations. It is some of the clearest evidence that newcomers and Britons in early medieval England also came together through ordinary kinship, not only through conflict or displacement. It is tempting, once the 5th and 6th centuries are settled in our minds, to assume the migration story ends there. A large study of isotope evidence, drawn from skeletons across early medieval England from roughly the year 400 to the year 1100, shows that assumption is mistaken. Isotope analysis examines chemical signatures stored in teeth and bone. Those signatures reflect the water and food of the region where a person grew up, so they can reveal whether someone spent their childhood somewhere other than where they were eventually buried. Applied across this period, the evidence shows continued and significant movement long after the initial wave. Notable mobility occurred in the 7th and 8th centuries, well after the point where the traditional story assumes settlement was complete. Migrants kept arriving from northwestern Europe, and the same evidence documents movement connected to Wales, to Ireland, and possibly to Mediterranean regions, involving both men and women. The making of England, in other words, was never one event confined to a single dramatic century. It was a continuing process, stretched across hundreds of years, shaped by different pressures at different times. Any model that treats the story as finished by the year 600 is working from an incomplete picture. If early medieval Eastern England could show continental ancestry as high as 76% in some sampled communities, why do modern English populations typically show a noticeably lower figure? The 2016 study from the Cambridge area offered one relevant estimate, modelling present-day samples from Eastern England as carrying around 38% ancestry associated with Anglo-Saxon era migration. That figure is model-dependent, built from statistical estimates rather than a direct measurement of any one person, and it should not be read as an exact number for every individual living in that region today. The gap between the early medieval figure and the modern estimate tells its own story. The centuries following the initial migration were not a dead end, preserving one population unchanged until the present. Later demographic events, including further migration and settlement, connected to Scandinavia during the Viking Age, continued to reshape the ancestry of people living in England, long after the period this documentary has focused on. No modern English person carries one fixed, simple Anglo-Saxon percentage waiting to be read off a chart. What they carry is the layered outcome of successive waves of movement, mixture, and continuity, stretching from long before the Romans through everything that came after them. So return to the schoolbook story. Angles, Saxons and Jutes crossed the sea, defeated the Britons, and became the English. That story was right about one enormous fact. Large numbers of people really did cross the North Sea, in numbers far too significant to have been a small ruling class. And they really did transform the culture and language of post-Roman Britain. The ancient DNA strongly supports substantial migration and makes a tiny elite-only explanation extremely difficult to sustain. Its crucial mistake was compression. It took a process that unfolded across centuries, involving a broad and internally varied population rather than three cleanly separate tribes, affecting different regions of England to very different degrees. and continuing well beyond the first wave. Then it flattened all of that into one short invasion, carried out by one uniform people who simply erased everyone who came before them. Oakington shows us that local ancestry could exist inside a fully Anglo-Saxon identity from its earliest generations. The Buckland family in Kent shows us that this mixture was not some background process happening far from ordinary life. It happened inside real households, across real generations, visible in the bones themselves. The most important distinction this evidence offers is the one between ancestry and identity. Being culturally Anglo-Saxon in the 6th or 7th century was never the same thing as carrying one uniform genetic signature. It never has been, for any nation formed through migration and mixture, which is to say, for almost every nation that has ever existed. English identity, from its earliest recognizable moment, was already a shared creation, built by people of varied and blended ancestry. That is not a smaller origin story than the one Bede told. It may well be the more remarkable one, because it describes something people built together, rather than something simply imposed by one group upon another. Were you taught that Anglo-Saxon England began with one invasion, or with a longer period of migration and settlement? If this reconstruction of early England interested you, the next part of the story begins when Scandinavian settlers arrived along England's eastern coastline and reshaped the population once again.